There we go. Now then, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison, and today I'm very thankful to be joined by Abel Wang, who is here today to talk about all things GitHub Actions. So Abel's been with Microsoft for about 5 years, been doing computers for about 20, been doing some form of like DevOps before it was even called DevOps, and has, I think, like all the experience in the world. So we're super lucky to be joined by him today. So what we're going to do is basically an interview style. I'm going to ask him questions. If you've got questions, please, please, please throw them into the chat window. We are live. There'll probably be some demos along the way, basically just whatever it is that winds up coming up. So with that, Abel, do you want to go ahead and take a minute and introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Abel. I'm the principal cloud advocate and the DevOps lead here at Microsoft. Like you said, I've been writing code for over 20 years, right? And I hate admitting that because that means I'm pretty freaking old. But that's pretty much all I do. I eat, drink, and live writing code, right? So I tell people I am that weirdo at Microsoft where I'll be writing code all day long. I go home, and the way I wind down is I cook dinner with my wife. We play with the dog, we eat, and then we watch TV. And then she picks a show. She always picks the show. And then I'll reach into my bag and pull out my laptop and start writing more code because that's pretty much what I love to do, right? It's what I do for fun.
Okay.
So I'm that guy.
All right. I dig it. I have to ask though, what kind of dog do you have?
What type of what? Oh,
Dog do
what
you
type of
have?
dog? I'm sorry. It's a mutt. So we got a rescue dog from the mean streets of San Bernardino, and she's a predominantly a pit bull, but there's some basset hound in her. There's some Rottweiler. She's a street dog.
Okay. That's fantastic, and yeah, I'm absolutely all about adopt don't shop. We have about a 1.5-year-old like Amstaff mix, so she's got like a little
Yeah.
Boston Terrier and a little lab, and again very much street dog from Houston, from Texas. So
Cool.
yeah, that's excellent. So let me start with I think probably the biggest question that I know that I had when I first started playing around in this space. That I was longtime developer, and so I kept hearing about all of this thing called DevOps, and everybody talks about it's this big mystical magical thing. So let me ask you this question, and let's start here. Is what is DevOps?
That is a great question, right? Because you ask 10 people what DevOps is, you're going to get 20 different responses. So I'm going to toe the company line and I'll give you Microsoft's definition of DevOps. So for
Okay.
us, DevOps is something very, very specific. It is the union of people, process, and products to enable the continuous delivery of value to our end users. So notice I said that really, really carefully, right?
You did.
Because my manager was the one that came up with that quote. So clearly, if I get that wrong, not so good, right? But every single word in that definition makes sense, and I love it because it's simple. It's one sentence, but every word in there makes sense. Notice I didn't say continuously deliver code, because what will that give us? Piles and piles of code sitting on a source control server somewhere. Who cares, right?
Right.
And notice I didn't even say continuously deliver features, because I could be delivering feature after feature, sprint after sprint. But again, if this is not what my end users need or want, I'm just wasting time, right? So the important thing is we have to continuously deliver value.
Okay. So then how do you make that happen? What's then the magic sauce that makes all the people and the process and everything actually work?
So you need to have all three of those pillars for DevOps to work, right? You need to have the people, you need to have the process, and you need to have the product. So the people, I think, is the most important part of this entire mix, right? It is absolutely vital. So if you don't have the people right, you can have the best process, the best products, you're still going to fail miserably. If you have the people right, you can have the wrong products, you can have the wrong process, and you can still be successful, right? So when I talk about people, I'm really talking about a culture. So this starts from the very top of your organization all the way down to the bottom, where every single person has to be hyper-focused on continuously delivering value, whatever that means, whatever that takes, right? So this is, and it's the most difficult to change too, because again, a cultural change, that's like a seismic shift that has to happen within a company. That's almost impossible unless you have someone from the top pushing it down saying, we must change, right? So that's absolutely vital. The next is you need to have a process that will let you iterate fast enough yet still deliver high enough quality code, right? So that's not easy to do. But if you start looking into this, you start realizing processes like Agile, they work incredibly well, right? Because it's highly iterative. And if it's highly iterative, you can course correct really quickly, things like that, right? You can do experiments, make sure you're building the right things, and sprint after sprint, you're pushing out into production. And finally, in order to do all of that, you need to have the right tooling. You need to have products in place that can enable all of this cycle.
Okay. Well, then that leads us, I think, perfectly then into the product. Actually, no, I'm going to ask you one other real quick question before we get into the product
Sure.
there. And I do want to call out that we've got Code with Sean, we've got Electric Havoc that are already calling out Donovan Brown, saying that his ears perked up. We already got to rub some DevOps on it. So obviously some fans of Donovan that are sitting out there as well. So how can you not love Donovan?
20 years I've known that dude, man. 20 years.
That's a long time.
Yeah, I am closer to him than like my own blood brother, right? I mean, we've been through everything together. So yes, he's an awesome guy.
I love that.
And he's my manager, so yeah, extra awesome.
That's great. I love it. So let me ask you the other real quick definition
Sure.
before we get into GitHub Actions here. And that is CI/CD. That for me, I could never tease apart what CI was, what CD was. And if I'm going to, like, make a confession here. For the longest time, I now know what they are, and in fact, I now know what they are, big part because of Donovan. But for the longest time, I would always just simply say CI/CD at all times, just because I didn't want to sound stupid of saying the wrong one at the wrong time. And I figured, if I just say both, then one of them is going to be right, and that'll sound good.
Yep. It's really common, right? So CI is continuous integration. CD is either continuous delivery or a continuous deployment, depending on who you talk to, right? So a lot of times we think about, oh, looks like we're having some network issues.
Uh-oh. Yep.
Oop, some network issues.
Yeah.
That was weird, a little glitch.
I think we're back.
But we were talking CI/CD. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yep. No, go ahead. Yep, CI/CD. Yeah,
Okay.
and now
So
I'm
we were
back.
talking CI/CD. So continuous integration, you can think of continuous integration as build, right? Anytime I check in code or anytime I touch my source control system, it should kick off continuous integration, which will download my latest code, build everything, make sure it builds, maybe it runs all my unit tests, things like that as well. Depending on how advanced your CI system is, it could even take your code, deploy it into like a staging environment to make sure everything looks good, right? So the idea is you want to make sure that your code is always deployable in a deployable state. And CD takes it one step further, where not only is it in a deployable state, but it's going to take those bits and start deploying it into your dev environment, QA, UAT, all the way out even into production.
So as part of that, you also mentioned unit tests. So let me ask you, first of all, like a real quick definition of what a unit test is. And I guess the follow-up immediately to that is what a unit test isn't, because I see a lot of people thinking that they're writing unit tests when they're actually writing, say, like integration tests. So what is a unit test?
All right. So the theory behind unit tests, and I'm a huge fan of unit tests because quality is absolutely vital when you write software. I mean, that's not negotiable. You have to have quality. And in a DevOps world where you're moving really, really quickly, you don't have the time to do end-to-end functional testing, which is how we used to do it back in our day, right? Back in my day. I remember old as dirt. So we would spend weeks, maybe even months doing end-to-end functional testing to shake out our bugs. We don't have time to do that anymore. So how do you maintain quality, right? So you have to write your code in a testable fashion and have things called unit tests. So the idea is every single line of code you write should also have lines of code that tests it to make sure it's doing what you think it's supposed to do. But here's the thing, right? A unit test should be just that. It should be one unit of your code in the sense that there are no dependencies. So for instance, I might have a software that will, a service that will go ahead and hit a database. Well, a unit test doesn't include making that database call, that SQL call, to get the data to return it back, right? That's a dependency, right? So in the truest sense of the word, a unit test will have no dependency. So instead of having the database connection, you'd mock it out, right? You'd mock it, and your mock would then return a known set of data that you could run your tests against. And this really hardens your tests, right? So once you were talking about like integration testing. So integration testing ultimately is once you have more and more of these dependencies, the more dependencies you have, the more, quote, real world the test is, but the slower your test will run and the more fragile your tests become. All right? So to give you an example of this, let's just use the database example.
Yeah.
If I have a database and I'm hitting that database and in order for my unit test to, well, I guess this would be an integration test, but in order for my test to work, I would need a known set of data in my database so that I can query it, I can do whatever, and it can return back the stuff that I'm expecting it to happen. So at the end of my test, I need to clean that database back up and make it look exactly pristine the way it was before I touched it. So that's only for one person. But what if multiple people are running these unit tests? All of a sudden, that's going to trash that data. And my tests, they don't mean anything now. Because now, if it breaks, is it because my test is broken? Is it because my code is broken? Or is it because the data is bad?
Right.
So that's why mocking starts becoming really, really important. Another problem with integration test is because once you have multiple layers, right? So maybe it's a database, maybe it then goes out to another service, and then another service calls something else. The more complex your system is, when things start breaking, you have no idea where it's breaking. Is it breaking somewhere like 5 services down the chain, or is it breaking in my code? You don't know. So it's really important you have these unit tests that only test your one unit of work.
Okay. I
kind of a long-winded answer.
No.
I'm really passionate about unit tests.
No, so am I. In fact, one of the books that I have back there is The Art of Writing Unit Tests. Like I'm a huge proponent of unit tests, and it's something that just not enough people do. And so when we're talking about setting up a mock, it could be something as just simple as having a list that's going to pretend to be our database. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything fancy.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Cool. All right. So then I guess the next question from here is GitHub Actions. So what is GitHub Actions? Where can that fit in?
So GitHub Actions is super exciting, right? So for those that don't know, GitHub Actions is GitHub's new automation workflow engine, right? So notice I didn't say anything about CI/CD because it is a generic workflow engine where you can automate all kinds of things that's happening inside of GitHub, including CI/CD, right? If somebody checks in code, go ahead and kick off a build, and then go ahead and deploy it into an environment. But you can do so much more with GitHub Actions than just CI/CD. Again, you can use it to create automated workflows for anything that happens within GitHub.
Okay. So what are some of the things then that I could do with it? Give me a couple of examples.
Let me give you a real world example that we use with the team that I lead. So I require all of my people, before they can check in code into the master branch, they need to go through a pull request, right? The problem is pull requests started getting lost in the shuffle. So people would miss pull requests. Some people would just ignore them or something like that. I don't know. But the end result was pull requests would start piling up. And there are amazing benefits to having pull requests and having the code reviews every single time you have to merge into master. But if you don't do them immediately and they start piling up, your dev work just comes to a grinding halt. Right? So this was really, really bad. So that was one problem that we had with pull requests. The other problem that we had is not only did I want not just me, but not only did we want to review the code, a lot of times we want to see that code running in an environment, right? In like a staging environment. So what that meant was for each pull request, what we wanted to happen is we wanted to build the application, package it up, get it ready to be deployed. We need to somehow magically provision a staging environment, then deploy our code, the pull request code that's been built, right, into that staging environment. And then we need to make sure it's configured correctly, and then they can see it, right? Of course, this URL potentially could be the same, potentially might be different. I don't know. If you want to have multiple pull requests happening at once, maybe they're unique or something like that, right? And of course, once you're done with your pull request, like if it's been merged or if it's been closed out or something like that, we need to clean all that stuff up, right? So who has the time to do that? And who has the ability to do that every single time perfectly without just messing something horribly up? So one of the things that we did was I was like, you know what? We can use GitHub Actions to automate all of this for us. And when I say all of it, I really mean all of it, right? So it's like GitHub Actions, it comes to the rescue. So to solve this problem, right, this is what I ended up doing for my team. We track all of our work using Azure Boards, the Kanban boards. So what I did was I created a swim lane that would hold pull request work items. So if I create a pull request in GitHub, I'm going to use GitHub Actions. The first thing that will do is it's going to create a pull request work item in Azure Boards, drop it into a special swim lane that I have in my Kanban board.
Okay.
So now, if there's a pull request, as a team, we look at our Kanban board, we see it immediately. And if somebody doesn't pick it up really quickly, as a Scrum Master, I can choke them, shake them a little bit until somebody finally picks it up and reviews the code. So that's one thing that's really, really cool. But we needed it to do more. So the other thing that we did is our application is hosted in Azure App Service. So I was like, oh, for a staging environment, we can just use slots, right? So on the fly, I'm using GitHub Actions to create a slot, which then I'll build my application, deploy my pull request code into that particular slot. But remember, I talked about multiple pull requests happening at the same time.
Right.
So now I'm generating a unique ID for the slots because they have to be different, which means the URL is to the application is unique, right? So I'm like, aha, let's continue with this because it's really hard for people reviewing the code to be like, okay, where's that staging slot? How do you find it, right? So we're going to have actions now write back to the pull request as a comment.
Oh.
And part of that comment is going to be the URL to that staging environment, right? So it sounds completely crazy. Oh, and of course, if you close it out, we're going to delete that slot. We're going to clean up, right? So it sounds completely crazy, but let me show you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. See if
go for it.
If you can see it live. All right. So here's my screen. What you are looking at right now is my Azure App Service, right? So if I go into my deployment slots at this moment, I don't have any slots except for my production. Right? All right. So over here, I have my Azure Boards. And as you can see, it's configured exactly the way I want it for my team. So we have an emergency swim lane. So this is for like live site incidences that pop up. We have to go in and do it. And then I have a pull request swim lane where all my pull requests drop in, right? So notice the pull request in the approved column right now is completely empty.
Okay.
And of course, then there's my in-sprint work items as well. So my code is held in GitHub, right? So if I make a change, let's go ahead and make some type of change. Let me just touch one of the README files. Let's added more stuff. All right. And let's go ahead and make this pull request about item number 432, I think. Yeah, let's do that one. So let me...
Just to pick on Brian?
We can pick on Brian or... yeah, let's pick on Brian.
I like Brian an awful lot. I've worked with Brian back when Microsoft Virtual Academy or MVA was a thing. So Brian is good people.
All right, cool. I was just trying to think, do I want to do this? Because it's actually going to send him an alert once we do this, but he'll be okay. All right, so I'm going to give it a good title, right? So this is for item number 432. And let's go ahead and propose a change. And once we propose a change, we'll go ahead and say, let's create a pull request, right? So as soon as we create this pull request, it's going to kick off that workflow, that crazy workflow that I talked about, right? So as you can see, a whole bunch of stuff are now happening. If we go to the actions field or tab over here, you can see we have a workflow that's being fired off. And what is it doing? In parallel, it's creating a work item in Azure Boards. Then it's going to go ahead and build my application and then package everything up, right? So it did both of those things in parallel. And when it's done doing that, it's going to fan back in, and then it's going to go ahead and provision the slot for me, right, in app service, and then it will deploy my application into that particular slot. Right? So now here it starts doing the provisioning and the deploying. And all of this takes a little bit of time to do. So while this is happening, let me show you how you can actually configure all of this.
Okay.
Right? So what you need to do is in the root of your repo, you need to have a .github/workflows directory. And inside of here, this is where you define all of your workflows in YAML. So I know YAML is not everybody loves YAML. Let's just go with that, right? Okay. It's not the most beloved form, but this YAML that GitHub is using is actually pretty easy, right? So the first thing that I have is, okay, let's name this workflow. And then in this on section, this is where I create my triggers, right? What's going to trigger this particular workflow? So I have one trigger, which is, hey, if a pull request happens, and it's either an open, synchronized, reopen, or a closed, and it's happening to the master branch, go ahead and trigger this particular workflow. I also have another trigger called workflow dispatch, and this is just, what that means is this is a manual trigger. So for debugging purposes, I was like, oh, I need a manual button where I can click it to kick off this particular workflow as well. So after you've described the name and you describe what your triggers are going to be, you can then describe your jobs. So my first job is to create a pull request work item in Azure Devops. So I created a custom action that does this. So basically, I'm using the REST API inside of Azure Boards to create the work item, drop it into the correct place and into the correct swim lane and all that good stuff, right? So I create an action that will go ahead and do this. Next, in parallel, I have my build, and then this just builds my application, packages everything up, and then uploads the zip file as a build artifact so I can use it somewhere else. So those two things happen in parallel. And so next, my deploy to staging, this doesn't happen in parallel. This waits, right? This waits for my build to finish because I can't deploy until the build's physically done. Right. So once the build is done, I look at the event, what's causing this trigger. If it is a pull request and it is not closed, that means, you know what, I need to provision a new slot and deploy. So the first thing that I do is I download my build artifact, which is going to be a zip of my website that I just built. And here's some debug comments that I do. But then I get my pull request values, right? So what I'm trying to get is the pull request number, because that's unique for every single pull request. So I use this later to create my slot and also to do my deployment. So the next thing that I do is using the Azure CLI and a service principal, I go ahead and log in. Right? So this is just an Azure CLI command, AZ login, pass in your service principal. And then using the same Azure CLI, I create my slot and I dynamically drop in the pull request number. And then I go ahead and deploy my web app into that particular slot. And when it's done doing that, I use another action that somebody else has created to go ahead and create a comment inside of my pull request that has a URL link back to this particular slot. So I think we should be done by now. Let's jump into my actions.
If we stalled long
and we can
enough.
see, hooray for that, it finished.
Okay,
right?
Perfect.
All right. So now, if we go back to our app service and we refresh this, dun dun dun, it created a new slot, right? With my pull request number.
That's cool.
If we go to Azure Devops or Azure Pipelines, look at that. It created a brand new work item for me. So now my team better jump on this and start reviewing this code. And if they don't, really quickly, I'm going to jump on it. And finally, if we go back to our pull request, here is the message that we created a staging environment with a link. And if I click on it, it'll take us directly to that slot, and bam, there's our application running.
That's pretty cool. So this, based on that one PR, that GitHub action, then that took all of your code, built it, zipped it up, created the new slot, deployed it out using zip deploy, and then went ahead and updated the PR with the link. And it went ahead and created the new item to make it easier to go ahead and track back inside of Azure DevOps.
Yeah. I like this demo because, yes, it does show CI/CD, right? Everyone loves to talk about CI/CD. But Actions is so much more than just CI/CD. You literally can automate anything that happens inside of GitHub that you want it to happen. And at the end of the day, these actions, out of the box, it comes with a whole bunch of actions. There is a marketplace where there are thousands of actions that you can just start using, point to it and start using it. And you can write your own custom actions as well. So custom actions is basically just JavaScript. So if it's just JavaScript, you can think of it as anything you can do from the command line, you can get an action to do really easily. Or anything you can do from a REST API, you can get an action to do really easily. And since it's just JavaScript, it's code, really what that means is you can make these custom actions do whatever you want it to do. And it's really easy to do as well.
I love all of that. So it's not just about then DevOps, that it could be that I just want to make sure that when there's a new commit coming in that it maybe automatically creates a PR or whatever it is. Like I can literally just have anything happen that needs to happen whenever something gets checked in.
Yep. It is a generic workflow engine that you can make it do pretty much whatever you need it to do, right? It's pretty cool. It's very flexible.
That's awesome. Electric Havoc asks the question, is the approval automated so that the merge redeployment is part of that same flow?
Is the merge redeployment? You know what? We can actually, I can just show you. All right. So here is my, what did I do with it? Oh, okay, wait. Here is my pull request. You know what? Let's just say this looks great, right? We're going to merge it. So we'll go ahead and merge it. Confirm the merge. So now the merge, it merges my code into my master branch now, which should kick off my workflow again. So if we go into actions, we'll see, dun, 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 here it is. And if we click on it, what is it really doing? It's running my close my pull request job. So this takes a while to do. Again, let me just show you the code. Sorry, I totally geek out.
No, this is, I'm laughing because this is cool.
All right, so here is my close job, right? My close pull request job. So what I'm saying is if this is, again, the event is a pull request and the action is closing it, right? So merging my pull request is going to close my pull request. First thing that I do is I get my pull request values from GitHub. So again, I want that unique pull request number. And then I delete my slot. So what do? First thing that I do, again, using the Azure CLI, I log on with my service principal, and then using the Azure CLI, I go ahead and delete that slot, and I dynamically pass in that pull request number, right? So I get that dynamically generated slot number. So when it's all done doing this, my slot should be completely disappeared. So if we go into my actions, this takes a little bit of time to do, but it looks like it finished. Sweet. So now if we go back to here, and these are my slots. If I refresh this, bam, deleted my slot for me.
That's fantastic. That's really cool. I want to ask you a real quick question
Sure.
that came up that when you had the YAML up, I noticed that you were pulling in secrets. So obviously you didn't post out in clear text your username and password, which typically speaking is not a best practice. Where are those secrets coming from?
There's a couple places you can store them, right? So one of the things that you can do is inside of your particular repo, if you go under settings, you have a whole secret section, right? And in here, I can throw in my API. So I've got my Cloudflare API key, I have my service principal secret, my publishing profile, things like that, right? And you can just kind of dump them all in here. And once you save it, they get encrypted so nobody can see it. Another thing that I like to do is I like to store all of my secrets inside of Azure Key Vault. Because number one, it's super secure. Number two, it's really, really convenient, right? Especially, you know how they make us change our passwords all the time, right? So if I store my secrets in here, right, inside of GitHub, in every one of my repos, now I have to go into every single one of my repos that use this particular password and change it, right? Or if I store all of my secrets inside of Key Vault, I can just change it in one place and then it'll just magically change everywhere. So there is if you go to the marketplace, there is a Key Vault action. So let's go to actions and we'll search for Key Vault. Maybe it's 2 words. Or maybe I'm spelling it wrong. Here we go. Azure Key Vaults.getSecrets, right? So there's an action already created where you just take this point it to your Azure Key Vault, it will decrypt your secrets, and then you can start using them within your pipelines.
That's fantastic. So then it looks like there's a whole bunch of actions that are already there. So I don't necessarily need to go off and write my own, that I could just take advantage of somebody else's work.
Yeah, and because we're Microsoft, right? So I have to show this. Because we're Microsoft, we have pre-built for you all kinds of actions pertaining to Azure, right? So if you need to do anything inside of Azure, there's probably an action that does it. If there isn't, again, it's easy enough to write your own. It's just JavaScript.
Okay. That's fantastic. I love that. So the other question that I had as you were going through this is you were highlighting the fact that it could do all of these really cool things with Azure. It could do all of these cool things with the code. And one of the big things that it was doing is it was creating a work item inside of Azure Devops. So here's then the next question. And this is one that I'm honestly asking for myself, as well as somebody asked it in the chat, is what's the difference then between GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps?
That's a great question, right? So let me give you my take, right? So this is not an official Microsoft answer. This is Abel's take on things. Microsoft spent a bajillion dollars buying GitHub, right? Because it is an amazing brand. And on top of that, GitHub reaches audiences that Microsoft will never be able to reach, right? This whole open source community. So this is a very, very important brand for Microsoft to have. They do very, very similar things. So it's kind of like, okay, why do we have both of these systems? So Azure DevOps exists. It is built-in services in Azure that provides DevOps capabilities, right? We are always going to need these types of services built into Azure. Because as awesome as GitHub Actions are, what if some of our customers, their code is not in GitHub? What if their code is in Bitbucket? What if their code is in, I don't know, whatever source control system of theirs.
They're still using Visual Source Safe.
Yeah, Source Safe. Ooh, yes, that goes back a few years. If your code is not in GitHub, you're going to need DevOps services that can build your application, deploy it all the way into Azure, right? Provision, do all sorts of cool stuff. So we're always going to need these services inside of Azure that can do DevOps-y type of stuff. But GitHub is our premium brand, right? Think of all the cool things GitHub can do for you already, right? They used to be just a source control system, but now they added all sorts of cool security features just built directly into GitHub, right? So if I check in a connection string with secrets or whatever, it'll flag you immediately and let you know, right? Using Dependabot, if I use an open source project that is, I'm using like an older version, it'll immediately flag me and be like, ooh, you're using an older version which has these security holes that you're literally using in your code. Maybe you want to update, right? So it already does some really cool things right out of the box. There's going to be more, right? GitHub's building more and more really amazing features into GitHub itself. So GitHub is our premium feature. Any new feature that they put into GitHub and Actions and all of that stuff, it may or may not float its way down to Azure DevOps services. It may, and it may not, right? It just depends on how premium of a service or a feature is it. If it's a feature that everybody just has to have and it's not a premium feature, it's just something that everybody needs, it'll flow through. But if it's like a super premium type of stuff, it's going to stay with GitHub.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay. So you're saying like GitHub first is where we're going to see cool new features. Cool
new features, yeah. Okay. Again, premium service, right? And it costs more. It's a premium service. Sure. So a lot of people ask me all the time, well, is Azure DevOps Services, is it going away, right? Are we just going to sunset it or just ignore it and Silverlight it or whatever they want to tell me? And
put it next to the Zune.
Right. And my answer is no, and I'll tell you why. For two reasons, right? One of them I already said, which is we will always need DevOps services built into Azure. Why? Because we are always going to have customers that won't have their code inside of GitHub. It's that simple. So if that's the case, we need DevOps services that can take care of those customers. The other thing is all of Microsoft's own internal code, our engineering system that we use ourselves in-house is Azure DevOps Services. And this isn't some specialized version of Azure DevOps Services. This is the exact same one that our customers use. So it took us a million years just to get that massive Windows code base into Azure DevOps Services. We're not going to be able to move all of that and all the automation. Right. Azure DevOps Services is going to be around.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
I dig it. I dig it. I totally get it. That's awesome. So, my next question from here is, we highlighted the fact that your GitHub action is doing an awful lot, and I saw it doing things like running command line processes and so forth. So where is that compute coming from? So let me ask that question first, and I'm going to have a couple of follow-ups from there.
Yeah. So GitHub provides us with runners, right? So back in the Azure DevOps Services world, we called them build agents. And I think in the GitHub world, we call them runners, or I can't remember what they're called. But basically, these are VMs that run, that's going to run our build, right? And just like in Azure DevOps Services, each one of these VMs has a known set of software that's already pre-installed on these VMs. And so you can use them there. You get all the flavors, right? You get Windows, you get Ubuntu, you get whatever. And so you get all of those flavors, and it can run your build for you. And again, known set of software that's on it. If you can install some stuff on it as well, because they just get destroyed when they're done. You can also run each one of your actions inside of a container as well, right? If you need special things installed or a specialized environment. So you can containerize each one of your each one of your actions that are running, and this way you can really, really customize it and make it do exactly what you need it to do.
So I can set up my own container and have it run inside of there then?
Yep. And of course, you can have your own VMs host a runner as well. Right, so I can maybe have a VM. I can install whatever software I want it. I can install the agent onto the VM. It will reach out to GitHub, and then hooray for that, you can use that as well.
Oh, okay.
So very flexible.
I dig that. So I guess my next question is around like cost. That if I'm doing a lot of heavy processing, is there a cost? Is there tiering on this to be able to scale up as needed? Things like that.
That is a fantastic question, and the answer is yes. What it is, I don't know. Okay. I can't answer that one because I'm not a salesperson. I just write code. Oh no, we have network problems. We're back again. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if it's my network being flaky or something. But,
yeah, I think it's on my end. Yeah, because OBS has gone red a couple of times here, so I think it's on. I think it's on my end. I am hardwired into my router, so I'm not sure what's going on there. So
what's going on? Yeah, I'm hardwired too, but you know how networks are. But
exactly.
Regardless, though, it's I don't know what the pricing is. But if you need to, I can find you links and stuff that will actually show the pricing.
No. That's totally fine. It was just much more of a curious how all of that happens behind the scenes, and if extra squirrels are needed, do we need to pay for the extra squirrel feed?
Yeah, I think out of the box you get like X amount of compute minutes or build minutes or whatever, and if you go above and beyond that, you have to pay for it. And there might be, again, I'm pulling things out of my butt right now because I'm not a salesperson. Yeah. I don't know. There's like things like if you're an open source project, you get either a lot more, or it's all free, or something like that. And if this is a private repo, then it's a different tier.
Okay.
Things like that.
No, that's totally good. But the long story short is it can scale if you need. And I'm also willing to bet that for most things that people are wanting to do, especially if you're like a hobbyist or just trying to play around, that there's not going to be a cost for that.
Oh yeah. Especially if it's open source, right? Especially if your repos are wide open.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's fantastic. Looking to see if we have any other questions in the chat window at the moment. If I had missed anything, somebody mentioned CodePlex. It's an old place to store code, which I appreciate. Yeah,
I loved CodePlex back in the day. I was crushed when CodePlex went away.
May it rest in peace. Trying to think. I know I had another. So let me ask you this real quick. So if I already have if I already have my code and I've already got my DevOps flow set up inside of Azure DevOps, would you recommend just keeping it there? Would you recommend moving it out to GitHub and incorporating GitHub Actions?
So it depends on what you're doing, right? GitHub Act. So again, I'm taking off my Microsoft hat, and this is just Abel. This is just me being a DevOps guy. Actions are freaking awesome, and they're great for CI. But at this moment, what is it? August 10th?
Yep. 4:40 p.m.
It's missing some features to do CD really well, right? I can deploy, as you can see, I can deploy my code, but what it's missing is I don't have gates, right? I don't have approval gates. And there are ways for me to work around it. I can use chat ops. I can, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I can do to work around it, but it's kind of hacky, right? So if I'm like an enterprise and I need to have that full-fledged pipeline with all the features, at this moment, Azure DevOps and Azure Pipelines, it is much more fully featured than GitHub Actions. So I would probably just have my code in GitHub, and I would link Azure Pipelines to it.
Okay.
Right. Will it be this way forever? Absolutely not, because the team, the GitHub team, that engineering team is fantastic. They are working frantically to bring it up so that, like feature for feature, it will be there.
Okay. Brett Miller mentions that he thinks Actions is tough for those wanting enterprise features for data sovereignty and things like that.
Yes. So that's one thing that GitHub doesn't do great, right? There's no data sovereignty at this moment. Of course, you can use GitHub Enterprise. You can, stand it up yourself on your own machines, things like that. But if data sovereignty is a huge deal, keep your code in Azure repos, where you can say, it needs to stay in Europe, or whatever the data sovereignty rules are.
Right. I gotcha. Okay. So let me ask a real quick DevOps question. Where would a team get started in, like, let's say that where we've got a team that either maybe we haven't yet incorporated this, we've got some old arcane system that we've been using. Now we've decided, all right, it's time to modernize. It's time to start down this path. Where should we get started?
So a common mistake that I see is that teams are just like, they hear a talk, they get really fired up, and they're like, okay, we're going to do this. And they try to change everything. And it just turns into a colossal mess, and it just explodes, right? So what I tell teams is, when you are ready to make this DevOps transformation, find one thing, and only one thing, that hurts the most. Address that one thing.
Okay.
At the end of your sprint, do an evaluation. Is it better? Is it fixed? If it's fixed, hooray for that. Let's find the next thing that hurts the most, and let's fix that. If it's not, how can we improve upon it, right? And just constantly iterate what hurts the most and fix one thing at a time until you start becoming a very advanced DevOps shop. So DevOps is never a one and done, right? It's never just, we turn on a switch, we do something, and magically we're DevOps now, or we bought DevOps and now we're it. It is a journey of continuous improvement, right? That's what DevOps is. Iteration after iteration, you fix one thing to make it a little bit better. And it can be anything, right? I've worked with people where, customers where they are not even using source control still. And I kind of live in this Microsoft bubble, right? So I'm like, what? How do you not use source control? Well, it's all on a shared drive that's backed up. It's fine, right? And I'm like, okay, so what hurts the most for you guys right now is, let's move you into a modern source control system, because there's so much benefits that you can get for that. Sometimes what hurts the most is they don't do Agile well at all, right? So before you can even talk about automation, you need to make sure you get the Agile processes down, so that sprint after sprint, you're at least building the right code at the end of your sprint. Right? Then you can worry about automation after that. But again, you find what hurts the most and address that.
I dig it. I have often joked that Agile is just simply a keyword for, we really don't have a process, so we're just calling it Agile.
So I am like I said earlier, I was a process consultant before I jumped into the world of Microsoft, right? So I literally flew around the world and I taught people Agile. I taught them what is the right process to have so that you can actually end up building the right software under budget, on time, and without piles of bugs, and it's actually the software that your end users want. Sam Guckenheimer, he's a really good friend of mine. He's just a DevOps genius. He'd said something that really has stuck with me. He told me one time that Agile is the first decade of DevOps. And that is so incredibly true, because you can't have DevOps if you can't even build the right software at the end of your sprint, right? So you need to be able to do that first before you start worrying about automation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. There's a question that comes in from No Ratio, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. Actually, real quick, the Chillennial then asks, what decade is ITIL? No Ratio asks, Abel, you've mentioned the case about running integration tests against staging database, and that you might need to reset that once the tests have been run. How would you tackle this scenario in real life with GitHub and with Azure?
I would not do integration test against my database. I would mock it.
Okay.
All right. Trying to run tests against a database is you're asking for trouble. It's going to. I just wouldn't do it. Yeah.
So basically, what you're saying is, if you're running a test and it's modifying a database, you're asking for trouble.
You're asking for trouble because database has latency, right? A lot of latency compared to other types of system. Let alone, what if you're running multiple tests at the same time? How are you going to account for that? It turns into a huge pile of let's just say trouble.
Okay.
So mock it. Mock out your database. Mock out your data layer.
Okay.
Right. So I'm not saying that there isn't a time and a place for integration tests, because you still do need those. But what we have found at Microsoft is the more integration tests. So we used to do all end-to-end functional testing, right? So eventually we got to the point where we're like, oh, we need to move faster. How are we going to do this? How are we going to build quality into our application? So somebody got the brilliant idea of, what if we take all of our functional tests and wrote automated UI tests? So we wrote a big giant check. A dev team in China created all of these automated UI tests for every single functional test we had. So then we ran it, and it ran. And ran forever, right? Just crazy slow, because that's the nature of the game. UI tests are slow. But even worse than that, a bunch of tests turned red. And we're like, well, I'm sure that worked. Ran it again. Those tests magically turned green, but other tests turned red. Right? It's just like, what is going on? You start getting false positives or false negatives all over the place. And that is also the nature of automated UI testing against a full end-to-end integration testing, right? Because, again, there are so many systems in play. You could have a network glitch way over here, and that could end up affecting your test, right? So the more deeply integrated your tests are, the more fragile they become. So we ended up going away from most of our quality is done through integration tests to now most of our quality is handled through unit testing. We still do some integration testing, but most of our integration testing that we do is kind of like happy path, just to make sure everything is like working. And the bulk of the testing that we do is with unit.
Okay. How about, I'm kind of going riffing off of that one slightly. So let's say that I've got a deployment that executes something that fails. What's the easiest then way to roll all of that back?
So how do you roll back a deployment that you've already deployed?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
And in particular, I mean, I know that something like App Services has, those fantastic slots. So obviously you could just, flip back to the last known good from there. But how about, let's say I had to make a schema change to a relational database. How do I revert that back? All
right. So I'm going to address this in two parts. There is the application tier and the data tier, right? Mm-hmm. App tier, it's actually simple enough, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can tackle this. One of them, like you said, is using the different slots, which is really, it's still the same concept of like a blue-green environment, right? You deploy your new code into one environment. You have two identical environments. Deploy your new code into one environment. If it doesn't work, you know what? Just swap them back, and hooray for that. Everything's fine, right? You got your old environment running. Everything's fine. So you can do that in a variety of different ways. You can use app service slots. You can use a VIP swap with two identical VMs. You can use a whole bunch of ways that you can do that. So that's okay. Data is much, much, much more difficult. The answer, no matter what people try to tell you, oh, let's try to roll back our data. You can't roll back data. You just can't. Imagine you have a database that is gigs and gigs and gigs, terabytes.
Right.
How are you going to roll that back? You can't, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this. One of the things that you can do is you make sure that your schema is backwards compatible, right? So this is kind of a simplified description. But if your schema is backwards compatible, then you can go ahead and roll back by doing nothing, right? You just roll back your app code, and then it just still magically works. And so, like, for instance, if you delete a column, you don't really delete it, you deprecate it. And then anytime you insert into it, you need to insert it in both places, the new place and the old place, just to make sure the data stays constant. And then when you are absolutely certain that this data is fine, then you go back and you clean everything up again. All right. So that's kind of a simplified way of describing it. But ultimately, if you really need to roll back your data, which a lot of people do, and you want to make sure there's no downtime, right? You need to do this in like a layered approach. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to create binaries that can handle both of your schemas. And then you need to lay your old schema and new schema basically like side by side in your database. But again, when you manipulate your data, you have to manipulate both the old and the new schema to make sure everything's fine. And then when everything is fine, you can go ahead and change your code. So now it's only doing the new schema. Then you can clean up your database, right? So it's a multi-step approach, but the benefit of this is now you never have to roll back. You just keep on rolling forward, and your database never goes down.
So in other words, there's a lot of setup that needs to be done.
There's a lot of setup that needs to be done, but this is a problem that has already been solved. Right?
Yeah.
We literally do this all the time.
Okay. So one real quick comment, and then I want to end on this. Is a couple of people have commented about your guitars and loving your guitars. Somebody pointed out, and I will openly admit I'm not a guitar person, but you have a gem in the background.
I do.
Yeah, that they really loved. So I just wanted to call that out. My last question then is actually twofold. Number one is, you mentioned YAML, and I will openly admit I'm not the world's biggest YAML fan. I don't know that necessarily there's a lot of YAML fans that are out there. I understand JSON is verbose, but give me JSON. I will take JSON over YAML any day of the week. But is there a GUI in anybody's mind for starting to put together GitHub Actions?
So there is a GUI of sorts, right, where basically it's a helper. You can say, when you bring up the editor inside of GitHub for like a particular action, on the right-hand side, you get a list of all the actions that you can use, right? So you can search for it, find the action that you want, and if you click on it, it'll basically output a whole bunch of YAML that you can then copy and paste directly where you want it. So it makes it a little bit easier.
Cool. The second question then that I have is, what are some good resources to get started? That if somebody wants to start playing around now with GitHub Actions, where should they start? Where should they go?
Oh, let me share my screen again. So where I got started ultimately was right here, right in the GitHub docs, all about actions. And it starts walking you step by step through exactly how to create an action or how to create a workflow, what the schema is for the YAML, some examples of how to do that. If you get to the point, and we'll make sure we drop these links so your viewers can see them. If you get to the point where you want to create your own custom actions, that's kind of cool too, because GitHub provides you with templates where you can just use the template and all of a sudden you have everything you need to create an action. It's just all there for you, and it'll copy it into your repo. So then all you need to do is just change a couple files, and you can start creating your own actions. If you want to see examples and walkthroughs of how to do that, on my blog, abelsquidhead.com, I have a couple of articles that walks you through step by step exactly how to create a workflow and also how to create your own custom action.
That's awesome. Fantastic. I think sorry, this is a long question. I'm just parsing it real quick to make sure I understand it before I ask it. So Firecopy asks, one thing I have wondered about GitHub Actions is related to that YAML question, wondering if it would be possible to write stuff, to write actions in programming languages in the future, like TypeScript, Python, Java, etc., like how Atlassian Bamboo Specs does it.
Is it possible?
Yeah.
Of course it's possible, because at the end of the day, it's just you spit out YAML, right? I can write anything that can spit out YAML.
Okay. Could you maybe go the other direction as well, that if I could just simply create a custom action for whatever it is that I want and then just have my YAML call that? I'm asking the question. I actually don't know what the answer is.
Can you say that again? I'm not sure I understand.
So you had mentioned earlier that you can create your own custom actions. Could I maybe just decide, hey, you know what? I don't want to get into the YAML. I know how to write things in JavaScript. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just write everything out in JavaScript as my Christopher Harrison custom action, and then my YAML does nothing but just call that custom action.
You can.
Okay. I'm going to guess that that's not the best approach based on your answer there.
The problem is it's not very reusable.
Right.
All of a sudden, you have this massive chunk of JavaScript that just does everything for your, for instance, let's just say we're doing CI/CD, right? Everything for your build and release. If you need to make a change, where do you make that change? And then also, it's like, okay, if something goes wrong in it, where did it break, right? You're creating a much bigger headache for you as opposed to just, okay, I'm going to use the YAML. The actions inside the workflow engine, it's basically a task runner, right? Or an action runner, or a step runner. It does one step after another step after another step after another step. And each step is an action that you run, right? So you can't have just one massive step that does everything. It makes it hard to debug and makes it reuse and all that kind of stuff.
All right. So you could do it, but just don't do it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And then somebody, and I think I've heard this name mentioned somewhere before, but somebody in chat with the name of Seth Juarez asks who your favorite neighbor is that lives in the same city.
Of course it's Seth, my favorite neighbor, especially when he shows up in my front yard wearing white bicycle shorts doing my lawn for me. Yes.
As a little background, Abel and Seth are very good friends.
Yes, really good friends, and he is a neighbor of mine, so that's hilarious.
Seth is also good people. Don't tell him I said that, though.
Nah.
All right. Well, Abel, thank you again so much for taking the time. This was a lot of fun. I hope everybody else had a good time. I hope you had a good time. Kind of a fun little exploration through DevOps, through GitHub Actions, and so forth and so on. So thank you again for taking the time and coming on and doing this. I greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. And for anybody else who's maybe interested in functions, we're going to be doing that on Tuesday afternoon Pacific time. We'll be doing IoT on Wednesday morning, and then doing Azure Static Web Apps on Thursday morning, all times Pacific. You can go check out the Reactor page for all that information. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye.